Welcome to Secret Story, just the view that I love, he said. Sophie quickly looked down. He had taken her smile to be that she was looking forward to this. She thought, just get this out of the way as quickly as possible. She just wished that she hadn't felt a tremble run through her at the mention of Josh. Come on, Miss Sophie Harper, I don't have all night, Tyler said in a commanding tone. She looked up at Tyler about to protest again, but he just looked down at her smiling, and placed a hand on the back of her head. I can manage on my own, thank you, Sophie replied, shaking his hand from her head. She had felt the same tremble within her when she first saw it. She hid it well though. After all, she didn't want him to think she was enjoying this. I hope my boyfriend is proud of how well I'm looking after you, she said, and smiled teasingly up at him. She continued to look up at Tyler's face. She just tried to forget who she was doing it to. Finally, she got into what she was doing, and although she couldn't forget she didn't like the guy, she couldn't stop. Josh played another card in the hand of poker he was playing, completely unaware that at that moment his beautiful, Josh smiled inside, retaining a perfect poker face as he looked at his hand. Tyler still couldn't believe she was actually doing it. He had thought she would just yell at him and storm out. He smiled down at his workmate's girlfriend. He wondered what Josh was doing right at that moment. And whether he suspected his girlfriend of doing what she was doing. He knew Sophie would never like him, but he also knew that she loved the kinkiness of the situation. Hey, Sophie, are you enjoying this? He asked. Sophie's response was to only look at him. He figured by the way she was working on him that she had cheated on him before. He had no doubt she had done this before. He just couldn't figure out who with. He knew it wasn't Richie. She hated him more than she hated himself, but it could be any of the others, or someone he didn't know. Either way, this was definitely not her first time at this. Get up, he said. What? Sophie said as she quickly stood up. Tyler pushed her backwards against the pool table. I wanted to do this in the lounge, but I guess here will be fine, he said. Do what? Sophie asked, sounding confused, and trying to catch her breath from her hard work. If you want me to stop, then I'll stop, he said, just tell me. She looked at him, visibly battling inside herself. You want to, Mr. Black Man? She said. Do you think I want? I hate you, but yeah, I want. She said deliberately. Tyler smiled at her. Whatever my hostess wants. And with those words he thrust forward. Tyler couldn't help but smile. Tyler was sure Josh would walk in any minute. But he no remorse, and no intention of stopping if her boyfriend did walk in. She looked straight up into Tyler's eyes. Finally, neither had enough strength to move. After a couple more minutes they were quiet for a few minutes as both of them took a breather. Josh played another hand of poker, smiling as his pile of chips grew. As he took the cards from the dealer, Paul now, he wondered where Sophie was, and looking around the table he noticed Ty wasn't there either. Odd that, he thought. She had said she wanted to play pool with someone, but surely it couldn't be Tyler. She hated the guy. As he looked at his card and placed his first bet, he thought about going to have a look in the pool room to see if she was okay, but thought to himself that she could handle anyone. And Tyler wouldn't bother her for long. It was a good job Josh didn't go to have a look in the pool room. Tyler smiled to himself, and he slowly walked up to her. Hey Soph, thanks for the game of pool, it was the best, he said with a deep chuckle. She looked at him then, still too weak to move. He continued to stroke her leg. No problem, she said bitterly, and tried to push herself up so she could sit up. Her arms were still too weak and she would have fallen back down. Sitting up, Sophie pushed his hands away from her weakly, and held on to the edge of the table, leaning slightly forward, so as not to fall back again. You enjoy that? He said smugly. She looked up at him and smiled slightly before pushing herself off the table so she could stand up. As her feet touched the floor, and she tried to stand, her legs gave way under weak knees and she only managed to catch herself on the table before falling over. Look what you've done to me, she said with a smile as she looked up at him, still holding the table for support. I've been weak-kneed before, but I've never not been able to stand. Well, you know what they say, he replied even more smugly. He moved away from her slightly to take in the whole look of her. Tyler loved that sight. Sophie just stood there smiling at him, leaning back against the table with her hands spread wide behind on the edge of the table. He was about to take that invitation and kiss her when the door to the hallway opened. Josh opened the door to the pool room and walked in. The first thing he noticed before his eyes found the people inside was how hot and stuffy the room felt. It was warm outside, but surely it shouldn't be this hot in here, he thought to himself. When he cleared the door to the hall, he saw his beautiful girlfriend leaning with her back against the edge of the pool table near the door he was coming in from, facing the sofa that was under the window. He smiled at her, and her face lit up when she saw him. He pushed the door closed behind him and walked over to her. "Hey, baby, I was getting worried about you," he said with a smile, as he walked up to her and placed his hands on her small waist. Her face was all red, he noticed. It must be the heat in here, he thought to himself. "Ah, baby, I was playing a game of pool with Tyler," she said, smiling up at him, eyes shining brightly. He loved her smile, so big and sweet. He looked up as she spoke his coworker's name, and for the first time noticed Tyler standing around the table from him. He smiled at him, and Josh returned the warm smile. "Hope she hasn't been whooping your ass too much, Ty, she's a hustler when it comes to pool," he said, smiling down at Sophie, then returning his gaze to his black friend. "No, man," he answered back smugly. "Yeah, he did, baby. He had me flat out before I knew it," Sophie said with a small smile for Tyler, who returned it to her. "Wow, he must be good if he can beat you, babe," Josh said, suitably impressed. "Yeah, he's the best I've ever played with." "It was unbelievable," Sophie said, looking up at him with those big, blue eyes. "I tell you, though, man, your girl there knows how to handle herself, though," Tyler said, smiling first at Sophie then at him. "She knows how to handle a cue, she's great with her positions." Josh smiled at them both. He knew Sophie was brilliant at playing pool, and he knew Tyler wasn't. "Come on, Ty, you can't play pool for shit," Josh said with a laugh, to let his workmate know it was a joke. Tyler just smiled back, but Sophie answered, "Seriously, babe." Josh smiled back at his girlfriend and laughed a little. "You must have let him win, baby. I've seen Tyler play pool before. Maybe I should have a game with you." "Nah, man, nah, you're okay," the black man protested quickly. Josh laughed, scared. Ty. "Well, I'm going back through to carry on taking everyone's money. Are you coming, Ty? You've got a nice pile of cash I'd love to get my hands on, if you're not scared, that is." Tyler stood straighter as he looked at Josh. "Man, I am not scared of you. I'll be right there." Josh laughed lightly again and looked down at his amazing girlfriend as she looked up at him, still smiling. "What you going to do, babe?" he asked her, smiling. "I don't know, babe, I'll think of something," she answered sweetly, and lightly kissed him on his lips. "All right, babe, have fun," he said to Sophie, then looked over at Tyler as he backed away from her reluctantly. He never liked being away from her, she never liked being away from him either. They loved each other too much. "I'll see you in a minute." Josh kissed his fingers and laid them on his girlfriend's lips, and smiled at her and her at him, before he turned and walked out of the pool room, closing the door behind him. He walked through the other door, closing that also, ready to play more poker. Smiling to himself, he thought of his gorgeous girlfriend Sophie and taking Tyler's money. He was good at poker, little did he know just how good Tyler had been at playing poker with his girlfriend. Josh smiled, and joked as the next hand was dealt, as he waited for Tyler to come and play. Sophie smiled at Josh as he turned and walked out of the room. He was such a great guy, so handsome and caring, she was lucky to have him. Her smile broadened as she turned her head to face Tyler as he walked around from where he had been standing to plant himself right in front of her. She looked up at the big, black man with her big, blue eyes, still smiling. "You still hate me?" he asked her, and she shook her head. "How's your legs, still weak?" he asked. "I can stand, but you me too good to walk right now," she said with a smile. That was all that was said. His hands reached down. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "Tyler, what are you doing?" she asked him again, still looking startled. He smiled down at her, and said, "I'm collecting what you owe me." "What about Josh? He's expecting you back through to play poker in a minute," she asked. "I want what's mine first, and I'm going to play poker with you first," he said. "Be gentle with me," Sophie said. She turned her head around to face the wall in front of her. That had begun. Josh sat gulping down some more of his beer to hide the bluff he was trying to play against Steve and Richie. He only had a pair of twos, but he had managed to bluff his way to a high-stakes win with only a 10 high. He slowly put the bottle back down on the table next to his pile of chips. Josh watched as Richie folded his cards and turned his attention to Steve. They sat silently staring at each other, both of them with poker faces. They sat looking at each other, both of them working out the odds, nothing else in each other's minds for a few minutes. Not even for one moment did Josh wonder where Tyler was, not while he was concentrating on Steve. "You know, your boyfriend could come in any minute," Tyler said, she loudly in response. "What would you say if he did? Would you want me to stop?" "No." She pleaded quickly, hoping that he wouldn't stop. She would have begged him if he had tried to stop right then. It felt so good. "What would you say if he did, then?" Tyler asked. "Am I better than your white boy boyfriend?" he said. "Yes, more than you know." Sophie into. Richie opened the lounge door to the hallway. He had left the others to play the next few hands so he could go to the bathroom. Only when he closed the door on the voices from the poker game, he heard something he didn't expect. Oh, a woman from the other side of the door opposite the lounge. Instantly interested, he walked closer to the door, quietly in case he was heard. Richie moved a little closer to the door. He stood there listening for 5 minutes, smiling to himself. There was only one woman that could be in this house. And that was Josh's girlfriend, Sophie, and there was only one guy not at the poker table, Tyler. Richie smiled to himself listening for a few more minutes. He moved away from the door and walked up the stairs to the bathroom. They were making enough noise that he was surprised nobody could hear in the lounge. As he walked into the bathroom, Richie smiled to himself. If Tyler could, then so could he. He laughed to himself as he closed the door. He figured that they had been for about 20 or 25 minutes or so. Josh played more and more hands of poker, winning far more than he had lost. Looking at the other players' piles, he frowned thoughtfully. Where was Tyler? He had been gone for over an hour now. He couldn't have been playing pool still with Sophie. She didn't like him at all, so she wouldn't want to play with him. Unless, of course, they had made up. He continued thinking as he looked around. Paul and Steve still had just over half their pile of chips, and Ty still had a pile twice the size of theirs. If he would only come back and play. Richie had hardly any chips left at all now. He'd be out soon. "What's up?" Paul asked, looking between him and Richie, the only players in this hand. "Just wondering where Ty is. He's been ages. I hope he isn't pissing Soph off," he said as he frowned at his cards. "They sounded like they were getting on when I walked past the door to go to the bathroom." Richie said quickly, "They're probably playing too much to notice the time." He grinned for some unknown reason, but that wasn't unlike Richie. He was odd. "I'm sure they'll be in when they're finished." "Nah, far from that I think," he said, grinning stupidly. He was stupid if he believed he could beat Josh. He had just been dealt another queen. He smiled at the rat-like, Japanese man as Richie matched his bet. His luck was still with him. His luck in poker was with him. "You rest now, Sophie Harper, you've serviced me well." "You sleep well, Sophie," he said, turning to leave. Tyler didn't look back as he walked out of the bedroom. Opening the lounge door, Tyler walked into where the other guys were. "Hey, Ty, glad to see you again, man. Where have you been?" Paul asked with a cheer as he walked in. "Hey, Paul. I've been playing with Sophie in the pool room, man." "That girl of yours is really good, isn't she, man?" he asked Josh as Sophie's boyfriend turned around. "Yeah, she is, man," he said quietly. "Where is she?" "Ah, man, she went upstairs, said she was tired," he said cockily. Ty, you couldn't have beat Sophie, Josh replied. Tyler smiled at Sophie's boyfriend. Hey, man, whatever, we both won, I'd say. He then sat down in his seat. You're just a bad loser, man, Josh said with a laugh. He didn't suspect a thing, but looking at Ben, he did. Ben was sitting looking very somber and quiet. He must know what him and Sophie had been up to alone. After all, he had done it before him. Still looking at Ben, Tyler spoke to Josh. Maybe, man, if I am, I'll try again. I'm sure Sophie's up for another round. He then smiled at Ben, who just looked down at his cards. Tyler then looked down at his own pile of chips, checking if anyone had stolen any of them. Then he glanced at Josh's pile, which was by far bigger than his, and dwarfed everyone else's completely. Hey, man, let's play some poker. It isn't right that you've got a pile that big, so I should have the biggest pile. Oh, cash, he said with a big smile. They all protested, and he just laughed, except Ben, who never looked at him. Come on, man, let's play. I want your cash, Joshy boy, so let's get serious, he said, as he flexed his hands to show impatience. Josh laughed as he began dealing the cards. I've been waiting to take your money, Ty. Everyone here knows I'm the best poker player here tonight. Tyler laughed loudly. When he settled, all he said was, I think we should let your girlfriend be the judge of that, Joshy boy. I bet you she'd say I was the best at poker. Josh didn't pick up on the difference in the way Tyler said poker, but no one else did either, except Ben, who took a long swig of his bottle of beer, still not meeting Tyler's eyes. Then, I'll just have to take all your cash to prove it. Ty. Ante up, Josh said, and Tyler smiled at him as he placed his ante chip in the center of the table. You might take all the chips tonight, Joshy boy, Tyler thought to himself. The card game continued, and Sophie's poker game was about to continue too. Josh sat back down in his chair facing his coworkers, with his beer that he had left in the kitchen as he was refilling the cool box with the last few beers from the fridge. Each of the others still had their beers sitting in front of them, most only half drunk. He tried as hard as he could not to smile. He knew that those beers were hardly touched now because Steve, Paul, Tyler, and Ben were all trying to concentrate as hard as they could to beat him. Their stacks of chips were all running low, none had even a quarter of what he had now. Richie sat in his seat now just swigging his beer and smiling at Josh every now and then. Josh couldn't understand why, because he was out of the game and had lost all of his money to Josh. Then again, Richie was odd anyway. He had been like that anyway since he came back in the room from his bathroom trip. He must have really needed to go because he had been up there about 15 minutes or something. Josh just thought that he was probably drunk. Putting his Japanese coworker out of his mind, Josh picked up the cards that Tyler had just dealt in front of him. He only took a quick glance before replacing them to the tabletop and taking another swig of his beer. He appeared neither concerned, nor unconcerned, about his cards. Nothing showed on his face. He smiled inside though. 3 aces dealt straight out. He didn't think he would lose, not with the luck these guys had been having all night. No luck at cards at least. He didn't know that 3 of them had gotten lucky with his girlfriend in one way or another. You guys wanting to call it a night, or are you wanting to lose the rest of your money? Josh said with a smirk, and a swig of his beer. You haven't taken it all yet, mate, Ben answered back. I've still got a load of chips here. Josh smiled at him. You won't have, mate, you won't have, he said, and smiled at him as he took another swig. Ben looked angry, as he always did when he was losing, and was about to say something, when the door opened, and Sophie walked in with a smile on her beautiful face. Hey, guys, she said sweetly, as she walked over and placed her arms around Josh's neck. Hey, baby, he said to her and kissed her arm. She responded by kissing his head. Hey, Soph, Ben muttered, and looked down at his cards. The other 3 said hello with smiles and such, before Sophie unwrapped her arms and walked around to stand beside Josh. Wow, look at all this money, she said, her voice sounding brighter than when she came in. Yeah, loads, huh? I'm about to take the rest of these losers' money, as well, he replied, as he smiled around at them all. Well, to be a good loser, Josh, unlike some Ben, I know that my load is a lot lighter now since I came here, and I think I've performed really well, wouldn't you say, Sophie? Tyler said, and laughed deeply. Ben shot a scowl at him for some reason, no doubt for his remark about Ben being a sore loser, but what astounded Josh was that Sophie actually smiled back at the black man, and from what Josh could tell, without any annoyance at all. Perhaps they were finally getting on after their pool game. Oh, I'd say you have performed top marks tonight, and I think your load is a hell of a lot lighter now, she said, whilst still smiling at him. Tyler laughed again. And Josh thought it was probably a joke they were sharing between them. Sophie's smile turned sickly when she looked at the man. In fact, it was more like a grimace, which made sense, as she hated his guts. She took her arm from his shoulders, and smoothed her outfit over her stomach and hips, and turned to look away from Richie, who just smiled and carried on drinking. Josh thought it best not to bring Richie around here again. Josh took Sophie's hand in his and gave it a gentle squeeze for comfort. She turned her face to him and smiled lovingly at him. I think I'm going to go outside for a bit, she said, the smile no longer on her pretty face. Knowing the reason why, that she didn't want to be around Richie. Josh just smiled back up at her, and once again gently squeezing her hand to tell her it was all right. Okay, baby, he said with a warm, loving smile on his face, we'll be finished soon, okay? Yeah, okay, babe, she said, and smiled down at him gratefully, before turning to walk into the kitchen. Josh watched his girlfriend walk into the kitchen and waited until he heard the back door open and close, then he turned to the other guys around the table again. Right, let's watch you all give me your money then, he said. Sophie lay on the lounge chair in the back garden, looking up at the waning light of the summer's day. The air was still comfortably warm, her smile returned as she began to think about Tyler again. Her feelings towards him had changed now. As she lay there, looking up at the slowly darkening sky, she pushed the worry about being pregnant out of her mind. No, she thought, I must calm down. So, Sophie Harper lay there, trying to stay calm. It was then that the door to the kitchen opened. Paul gently opened the back door of his co-worker's house and slowly peeked out. He had no reluctance to trying to seduce his friend's girlfriend. He slowly moved out into the warm air of the darkening evening. He saw Sophie lying down not far from the door of the kitchen on a low, white lounger chair on a paved area of the garden, as he slipped quietly out of the house and tried to gently close the door. He slowly, and quietly, made his way towards her sleeping form, stopping at the end of the lounger facing the kitchen windows, just a few feet away from her. Ulif, Paul jumped and turned to look down at Sophie. She was still lying exactly as she was, only that she had turned to face him. Sophie moved quickly. Hey, you're going to get caught in your zip, she said, smiling beautifully at him. She pulled at his hands. Now, let me help, she said sweetly. Actually, I think I should have another look at this, she said, sounding very innocent while looking very playful. After all, you did get a chance to look at me for long enough. She laughed gently at the obvious look of startlement on his face. She had been awake all the time he had been looking at her. It seems that you got bored of playing poker, so you came out here to play with yourself. I lost, he answered back nervously. So, I thought I'd come out here, and talk to you. Well, it's nice to talk to you, she said. Look, Sophie, I'm sorry. Okay, please, don't say anything to Josh, he began nervously. Hey, she said, smiling up at him again when his hand stopped moving, I'm not going to say anything to Josh, and I don't want you to try putting this away until I say, okay? But you just said it was bad to play with myself. I thought you were angry, he said, sounding totally confused. Her smile deepened as she saw how confused he was. And impossible as it sounds, she grew even more beautiful. I said that it was bad for you to play with yourself, she said, and then her smile turned from sweet and amused to very playful, but I never said that it was bad for me to with you. Paul felt his heart stop, and spoke before she could say anything, and whenever he did anything without thinking, he always did something stupid. You're going to jack me off. Sophie smiled in a very amused way at how stupid he had been, but that playfulness returned very quickly. Things were moving fast and out of control. He always made a fool of himself in those circumstances. He had to regain control again. She smiled up at him playfully. And he slowly began to smile back down at her as he finally caught on to what she had meant. When she saw that he had finally understood, she asked him, "So, would you mind?" she said as she smiled. He was now calm and in control, and everyone knew that when he was calm and calculated, he was at his best. Sophie smiled teasingly up at him. She said teasingly, "Enjoy." And with those words she leaned forward, still with her eyes staring into his. She sucked as she thought how easy it had been to get what she wanted from Paul. There was no flirting, or talks, or anything. Looking up at his face, Sophie saw him still looking over her head. What was he looking at? Josh couldn't have caught them. Otherwise she would have been out of the house already. Confused, Sophie tried to look around quickly. She turned to look behind her. There stood Steve. "Yeah, well, I prefer the feel of this game, and besides, Josh is too good at that game, but this one I'll beat him hands down on," he said. "I look forward to you proving that to me." He smiled again at her, and Sophie turned to look at Paul again, who was now looking down at her calmly smug. "Yeah. He may be taking the money," Paul said smugly. Josh's hand was the best possible in a hand of poker, a royal flush, but he watched the other two players carefully. He smiled inside as he looked around the table. He had already knocked 3 of his friends out. And now only Tyler and Ben remained. Richie was there too, smugly grinning at him for some reason Josh couldn't understand when he had lost all of his money tonight, but Josh didn't take much notice. All of his attention was on the other 2 players. He had to concentrate to win, and he had to win to get Sophie's surprise for next week. As Josh looked around the table, he didn't see the 2 of his coworkers that were missing from around the table. Josh didn't know that as he continued to watch his black coworker and his best friend, that right at that moment as Josh raised Tyler's bet just enough to tempt Ben to raise it again, Sophie was in heaven. Josh was oblivious to it all as he played to win money for her surprise. As Tyler and Ben slapped the table when he revealed his hand, and complained verbally about him cheating, after an hour as the 2 guys slumped onto the other 2 loungers on the patio to rest, Sophie just needed to rest. Josh couldn't believe it. Just when he thought that he had the game won, Tyler had come on to a lucky streak, and Ben's luck wasn't too bad either. He couldn't believe it. Figuring he had to concentrate completely on the game, he put any thoughts of anything else out of his mind. As Josh concentrated on the poker game completely, and he certainly didn't see the 3 of them collapse. "Say, can the hostess be of any more service tonight?" she asked. They both turned to her. But it was Paul who spoke. "Are you still wanting more action?" he asked. Her smile deepened. "Well, I just thought, so, maybe you would want to, change places." She made it sound only half a question. "Whoa, you're serious?" Steve said, gaping at Paul when she smiled and nodded. "So, are you going to join in?" Sophie asked hornily, but Paul stood looking at her, not moving at all. This time he moved. He smiled deeply and walked to the end. Josh smiled inside as the cards were dealt for what could be the last hand of the game. All the money was in the pot this time, and there could only be one winner. He smiled as he looked down at his cards, as all of them were dealt straight down because all of the chips were in the pot. He was about to win the game and all of the money, and Sophie was about to get her prize too. As Josh's 2 workmates sat down on the lounger with Sophie to regain their strength, and completely out of her mind. She lay there for another 15 minutes, unable to move, and feeling like she was in a different world. She lay there until she had strength enough to get up, straighten her dress, and her hair, and walk back into the house. "Woo-hoo! Show me the money. I said, show me the money," Josh shouted as he capered around the room after winning the final hand. Ben looked unhappy about his loss. Tyler didn't seem to care much, while Richie still smiled at Josh for some unknown reason. "Thank you, gentlemen, I hope you all come again," he said, as he laughed at the sight of all that money he had just won. What a great night, he thought to himself, Sophie's going to be so happy next week. Just then, Josh saw Steve and Paul walk in from the kitchen. Josh didn't even stop to think why they had both come in from the kitchen, let alone why they were both smiling so proudly, because he was too overjoyed about winning all that money. Well guys, I don't know about you, but I think taking all of your money deserves to be celebrated with a nice, cold beer, he said and reached to grab one of the last few beers. Each of the other guys took a beer as well, and Ben mumbled something about losing. But then he always was a bad loser. Tyler just sat back seeming to not care and drank with everyone else. The drinking went on for another half an hour, around the green felted table, and soon everyone began to lighten up and start laughing and joking with each other again. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm going home now to crash out, Tyler said as he stood up, placing his empty bottle down on the table. Yeah, me too, Ben replied and drained the last of his beer before joining Tyler standing up. The rest of the other guys all said that they too were going and stood up after finishing their beers, before heading towards the door to the hall. Just as they were about to walk through the door, they all stopped as someone cleared their throat behind them all, and they all turned to see Sophie leaning against the doorpost of the doorway to the kitchen. Hey, is no one going to say goodbye to me, then? She asked sweetly, as she stood there dressed in that hot black silk maid's outfit, her tiara glinting in her perfectly positioned blonde hair. The guys instantly fell over themselves saying goodbye to Josh's girlfriend, exclaiming that they had had lots of fun and a great night. Sophie's smile broadened, except when it fell on Richie, as they all complimented her on being such a great hostess. Josh smiled as his workmates praised his beautiful girlfriend, she was amazing. He smiled as she replied. Thank you, I'm just glad that I helped keep you all entertained tonight, she said, smiling playfully. Oh, and guys, thanks for all of the loads of money that you've lost here, it was a pleasure, watching you all lose it all. We'll have to do it again soon, I think, what do you think, baby? Josh smiled back at his loving girl. Sure babe, if these guys don't mind losing more of their cash, I certainly don't mind taking it, he said with a smug grin for his friends. They all said that there was no chance he would win again, so they would play him again whenever he wanted. He would have to remember that for next time he needed some money fast. Good night then, guys, Sophie said, as she walked over towards the sofa pushed against the wall. She walked very unsteadily, and her legs almost collapsed under her as she walked, but Josh didn't register any of it. The guys said their goodbyes, and Josh followed them out of the front door so he could talk before they all went home. This had been a great night, and next week was going to be one of the happiest moments of Josh Seymour's life. He felt happy and free as he wished his friends good night. Sophie sat tiredly on the sofa and sighed. She felt so unbelievably worn out, she stretched out as she sat there looking forward to a good, long sleep. She certainly needed it, and she felt like she would sleep for days. As Sophie Harper sat there looking forward to sleep, she ran over in her mind the events that had happened that night. And without Ben being, none of the rest would have happened. After Ben had gone, she had gone into the pool room where she had agreed to that crazy bet with Tyler, only to make an even crazier one herself. After being Tyler's, he had to carry her upstairs to sleep because she wasn't able to even think straight, let alone move. Sophie quickly tried to forget about what happened with Richie. Next, she had come downstairs, and gone outside partly to hide so she didn't have to see Richie, but also partly because she still hadn't been strong enough to stand. Only when she had gone out, Paul and Steve had decided that they wanted she had always dreamed. Sophie wouldn't have believed any of it was real. She thought about Josh and how much she loved him, how much she wanted to be with him forever. She didn't want to be with anyone else. After a short while, Sophie stretched again and smiled to herself. She had enjoyed tonight, very, very much so, and she wasn't going to stop now. Just as she smiled and stretched, yawning widely, Josh came through the door with a big grin on his face. Hey, baby, he said happily, I won all of it tonight. What do you think about going upstairs to celebrate? Not tonight, baby, she replied, as she yawned once again. I'm so tired. Josh's smile slid from his face. The disappointment clear. So, Sophie got up as quick as she could and gave him a big hug. We can celebrate tomorrow, Mr. Rich Man, she said playfully, as she looked up into his eyes. His smile returned quickly. Come on then, let's go to bed, we'll clean all this up tomorrow. She smiled at him as they made their way out of the lounge. As they walked up the stairs towards their bedroom, Sophie smiled, content and happy with not only tonight but with her life in general. She knew that from now on, things were never going to be the same. She held tightly to Josh's arm to show him she loved him as well as for support, and she smiled lovingly at her caring boyfriend as they went to bed, where she slept soundly the moment her head touched the pillow. To be continued.